Right. Well, welcome to this session. This is all about exam 7698. This is the exam prep for installing and configuring Windows 10. I'd like to welcome everybody that's in the room here this morning at Ignite, but also hi to everybody who's watching this back afterwards as well. We appreciate both kinds of folks. My name is Chris Rhodes. I work for a company in the UK called IT Masterclasses. We're a training company. We do a lot of teaching and getting people ready for exams. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I have been for about 21 years. So I'm kind of used to coaching people, getting people ready for tests, teaching them what they need to know. I'm also a Windows MVP. And what we're going to be covering today in this Cert Prep session is a walkthrough of the exam objective domain areas, of which there are 3. We're going to be talking about implementing Windows, configuring and supporting core services, and finally, managing and maintaining Windows. And you can see that it's basically 1/3 of the marks on the exam for each area. Each one 30 to 35% approximate marks. What I would encourage you to do is keep up to date. This screenshot was taken from just yesterday, just to make sure things were up to date. As far as today is concerned, the exams can change. They can modify what's on the objective domain, and you really do want to keep checking that to make sure you're still current, especially if you're watching this back some months after we've recorded it today, because objective domains can change. So that's just a quick word of warning. This information we're presenting today is current as of literally today, September 2017. Okay? But Windows 10 is now part of a bunch of services that connect to the cloud. We've heard this week at Ignite about Microsoft 365, Windows as a service. You've probably been in sessions hearing that stuff. So Windows is a continually evolving product, right? So we've got builds that come out. We've got the fall creators update coming very soon as well. So I don't have the crystal ball to know what's coming down the line in months to come and how that might affect the exam. So what I'm presenting to you is the knowledge I have today based on the objective domain information of today as well. But please check this if you're not taking the exam for another few months. So what we're going to do then is walk through each of these 3 main sections, drill down, explain what's involved in each area. We're going to go pretty fast through a lot of this. We're going to deep dive on some areas, skip past others. That's the way we're going to go get it done, because we could spend 6 hours, honestly, drilling down every single subcategory, and we just don't have the time. So we're going to try and give you a good overview. And let's start with the first topic area in the first section. And this is all about implementing Windows. So the kinds of areas you're going to get questions on are going to be preparing for install, things you need to do before you run a setup, before you deploy Windows on a machine. You need to know about the install process itself, and not just clicking through it in a GUI sense, but also how to automate that as well, having the skills to use tools to help you get that done efficiently. We'll talk about devices and device drivers, and also things you need to do post-install to get machines ready for users as well. And finally, enterprise environments. Some of you here may not work in an enterprise environment. There are sort of particular features that are only relevant in that space if you're running Enterprise Edition. So if you're somebody who's used to deploying Windows 10 Pro, you need to be aware of those things. What's the difference between Pro and Enterprise? If you don't have that at work, you need to research that and find out what both SKUs actually do. So in terms of preparing for install, the kinds of things that come up on the test, as you can see here, determining hardware requirements, we'll drill down on those in a second. Also choosing between the different kinds of install. Should I do an upgrade or should I do a clean install? You also need to be aware of the additions and some of the nuances between them, as I've just said. And know about different features, what's required for Hyper-V, for example. So let's drill down on some of those. The hardware requirements are fairly easy to remember, and they're not really changed that much since Windows 7 either. But if you get a question about, you have this machine, it's run Windows something previous, and you're planning to put Windows 10 on there, will it run it? You can fall back on these figures. A couple of things I will call out that I've put in bold are memory requirements. 32-bit Windows needs a little less. 64-bit Windows needs a little more. 1 GB and 2 GB of RAM being the minimums, respectively. Now, these are the minimums in this table, by the way. Anything above that is obviously great. find out what else you need for other specific features. This is a generic install requirement list. But if you want to have, for example, Hyper-V, there are other things you've got to have. You've got to have a 64-bit computer. You've got to have hardware support actually on the computer to run that. It won't run on all devices. Okay? So make a point of going and finding what do I need for each feature. One thing that can help you in a larger enterprise, apart from going computer to computer, is to get that information centrally. And one of the things that they call out on the objective domain is using the MAP toolkit, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, which will help you to enumerate what's on your network and provide you with a central report that shows you which computers are eligible for Windows 10 and which ones are going to fall short because their hardware doesn't meet the grade, for example. Has anybody used the MAP toolkit in this room? Let's have a quick show of hands. Ooh, about 20%, not so many. So one call to action I would say is try it out. It's a free tool. It's not overly complicated. It'll take you 10 to 15 minutes to download, set it up, have a quick play, have a look at some of the reports. There's even built-in sample data as well, so you don't have to have it run on your network if that's not applicable. Have a look at it, get familiar with it. The toolkit can be used for all kinds of scenarios like Windows Server assessments, Hyper-V assessments, but it's the Windows 10 deployment stuff you want to look at in that tool. Okay? And let's talk about deployment options. This is something I find candidates often get confused with, or they're not sure of the different routes to take when it comes to deploying Windows. First of all, let's talk about wipe and load. Wipe and load is about deploying an operating system to a computer where you're going to essentially pretty much wipe the hard disk as part of that process, deploy a fresh image onto the same computer. But along the way, you might want to install applications, add device drivers, and possibly also back up user data and restore that as part of that process. We'll expand on that in a second. In-place upgrade is really where Microsoft would prefer everybody to be. Upgrading from, say, Windows 7 or Windows 8.1 to Windows 10, the in-place upgrade is the Microsoft favored approach, but it's not always applicable. There are certain times that doesn't work. Especially, for example, if you're going from 32-bit Windows to 64-bit Windows for the same machine, that's not possible. You have to do a wipe and load. And provisioning is also something people don't know that much about. Who's used the Windows provisioning tools to make provisioning packages? WCD? We'll talk about that a little later on. Okay. Provisioning packages take an existing install and modify it. So you're not reinstalling the operating system from scratch. You're not deploying a bare metal image to the computer. You're modifying something that's already there. So you might be taking, say, a Windows 10 Pro machine and modifying it to become Windows 10 Enterprise. Not reinstalling the operating system, but deploying a very small provisioning package to get that done. There's more content coming up on that soon. But if you look at the bottom of this slide, I'm calling out, when would you use each kind? When is it applicable? What scenario works best in each case? But also be aware of the restrictions. As I've already mentioned, going from 32-bit to 64-bit Windows isn't going to work in the case of an in-place upgrade. You can't do that, but you can do wipe and load, for example. So here's a kind of decision tree on how that would work. If you're going to do a new device, companies would often deploy their own corporate image and do a replacement of anything that was on the C drive. However, you can do in-place upgrades, and that should be the mainstream for Windows 10. That message kind of changed since Windows 8.1. The in-place upgrade is the preferred. As long as apps are going to be compatible, you can retain the data, and you've done some checking beforehand. So it's a little bit more risky in an enterprise environment, but you need to mitigate that risk by doing application testing, for example. If that doesn't work out, the wipe and load will get it done. Wipe and load is going to take a corporate image, but you're going to be using a backup and restore method to get the user data and settings preserved through that process. Okay, so the flow works something like this. We'll use user state migration tool as part of a wipe and load to back up user state. I'll drill down on that in a second. You'll remove the existing operating system, put down your new corporate image, and then finally you'll install applications just before you restore the user state. And the reason we do it that way around is I might have an application preference that I've configured in Microsoft Word. I need to put that preference down after Word got installed. If I did it before, and then I installed Word afterwards, I might get the Word default setting back, and that's not what I wanted. So the user state comes on at the very last minute before giving it to the user. I've put down here at the bottom, there's different ways to get this done. You could do it manually, you could create a script. You're probably going to want to look at Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, MDT. You might want to do it through System Center if you have Configuration Manager. And again, this is an area where some people might fall down because they don't have System Center at work. But still, research that. If you don't have it, it's well documented. Right? You can create task sequences in System Center to get that done. If that's not something you've tried before, there's virtual labs, there's plenty of documentation on how to get it done. In-place upgrades, much more straightforward. You're pretty much just installing the operating system, but assuming that the apps are good to be preserved. We're not typically adding or removing applications through that process. And actually, the user state may not need to be done at all. That's optional in this process. But you can back up and restore user state if you prefer. Okay. So considerations for in-place upgrade. We're assuming that computers are eligible, the operating system itself, the applications, and we're moving to a like-for-like SKU. So that's another consideration. Going from Pro to Pro works, Enterprise to Enterprise works, but jumping up and down isn't always compatible. So do check on that. Provisioning then is more of the new kid on the block. We're not re-imaging computers with this. We're creating provisioning packages. So if you haven't tried this before, you definitely want to play with the tools I'm going to show you in a second and get some experience with it. There are sessions on that, in fact, today here at Ignite, later on this afternoon. So I would recommend you go and check that one out. I think it's 12:45. There's a session on that today. But this is all about transforming a device, not re-imaging it, not uninstalling things, but modifying it in place. So they've made it easier for people to be able to provision in the field, or for IT to take an off-the-shelf computer and tweak it just a little bit to make it applicable to their environment. So maybe I change my Pro installed SKU to Enterprise and then have it do a domain join, for example. That might be the steps in my provisioning package. We can also get it to trigger application installs too. So it's like a sort of smaller version of MDT task sequences, if you will. So if you haven't come across it, do download and have a look at this. It's a free tool. This will let you modify and create provisioning packages. These end up as files, which are, I'm trying to remember the file name now, PPKG file extensions that Windows can install from USB media or from the hard drive. You can actually send these out via email to users who are in the field as well, so they can do this themselves in place. But the provisioning package is relatively small. It contains a set of instructions, really, that you've built out using that tool set. The tool set is very GUI orientated. It's kind of straightforward, but it's one of those things. If you've never touched that, if you've never played with that, you're going to potentially lose marks on the exam, and I wouldn't want to feel like you were going to fail the exam by 1. That would be bad. All right? You don't want to do that. So this is an opportunity. Sit down, spend 10 minutes on it. 10, 15, 20 minutes is all you're going to need to get a master on what that tool is about and how to create those packages and use them. Now, a similar tool, and please don't get confused because the acronyms are kind of similar as well. Another tool that's in this space is Windows System Image Manager. And by the way, you can get that from the Windows ADK. That's a free download where all these tools are included. The ADK contains Windows SIM, and that's really used to create answer files. So if you're looking to automate an install of Windows setup, this is the tool that you want to get for that to create the answer file. Please make sure you know how to not just create an answer file, but how to associate an answer file to an install. Maybe you're installing from an ISO or a DVD, and you might want to put that answer file on a USB stick if you're doing one-off computers, but more likely in an enterprise environment, you're probably associating the answer file to an image that's stored on a WDS or Windows Deployment Server computer. If you haven't come across that, install it, have a look at how that works. You can upload images to WDS, but you can associate these custom answer files that you're creating to those images. So when they deploy, they do all the tasks that you want them to do, such as domain join, computer rename along the way. That kind of information is what's stored in the answer file. This also works with MDT. So you can use that tool in isolation, but you can also build it up and use it with Microsoft Deployment Toolkit as well. Deployment is kind of one of those things. The way I describe deployment, it's a bit like a party. And bringing all the different ingredients to the party is where it gets better. So yeah, you could use that on its own, and that's like having some guests at your party. But if you bring MDT, that's like having some beverages and some snacks. You know, the more of these you bring, the better the party is. And we'll build up some more on that in a minute. I'm not going to call out the whole table. This is here for reference, for takeaway. Upgrade pathways. Learn the do's and the don'ts. What can I do? What can't I do? What pathways are going to upgrade and which ones are not? And we'll spend a moment back on USMT. We called it out a few slides ago, but this can potentially be quite complex. When we talked about backing up and restoring user state as part of, say, the wipe and load scenario, we need to use USMT. But USMT really is just a couple of programs, scanstate.exe and loadstate.exe. Whilst the names of those kind of give you a clue of which one's backing up and which one's restoring, you do need experience with these. Especially, you need experience with how the XML files work in conjunction with them. You don't just run scanstate.exe. You run scanstate with a whole bunch of parameters. You specify migration files. These are the XML files we're discussing. Those migration files contain a list of what you need to back up and restore. So am I looking for certain file types on the hard drive? Am I looking for certain settings in the registry? That's going to be included in your XML files. There are sample ones you can customize, but you can make your own as well. One thing that I find catches people out is the syntax. These are command line only programs. If you're going to run them, you have to know how those work. And good or bad, that makes for good exam questions, because we can say, well, which would you run? If you want to back this up, which would you run? Which is the migration file you need to back up X? Okay, so I would spend some time looking at these. They're very well documented on TechNet to learn some of the syntax, especially around some of the common scenarios. You're backing up this computer, you're restoring to here. What's the order of work here? What's the syntax going to be needed to get that job done? Who's got experience of running those actually in the real world? About 30, 40% of people. Okay, so the rest of you, there's a takeaway for you. Please read up on that. A quick overview of the process works like this. On a machine, you're going to be doing, let's say, a wipe and load upgrade on. We're going to run scanstate first of all with the parameters that I've hinted at. That's going to back up the information to a USMT store. That could be on the same hard drive. In fact, that's called a hard link migration, where we don't actually move any data off the C drive. It stays there, but we use a hard link store. But you can back that up to the network. A lot of admins will want to do that. They'll want to back up all the settings over to a network location so that they have the option of wiping the hard drive and then laying it back down later. So the process works something like this. Back up the settings using scanstate. Scanstate will call out the XML files that you've told it to, read the information from those XML files to say, hey, this is what we want to back up on that machine. The data is collected and put in the store. And then once you've imaged your computer, installed the applications, you're going to come around and run load state and do the reverse, using basically the same XML files, but in reverse. So one backs up, one restores. As I say, it could be that we're writing back over the network to the C drive, or we've done a hard link migration, in which case we're just reestablishing the links back to the new install on the C drive. It sounds kind of straightforward, doesn't it? But unless you've actually done this, it's not so easy. Okay, let's see if you were paying attention, shall we? Oh, I didn't warn you? There's a quiz. I'm sorry. So let's have a look at this practice question. Your company's desktops run 32-bit Windows 7 with Service Pack 1. You're planning the migration to 64-bit Windows 10. You have confirmed that all of the hardware is compatible with 64-bit Windows 10. The migration must meet the following requirements. User settings and files must be preserved during the migration. Existing hardware should be used. What is the best path for this migration? So we've got a few options there. What say you? Wipe and load. Yeah, good. And the reason for that is we want to use the same hardware, so it's not going to be side by side. And we must preserve the user information as well. The kicker here is, which you quite rightly, yes, this 32 to 64-bit switch. So that's going to preclude me from being able to do an in-place upgrade. Okay, so you've got to look for those little, what's the catch here? All right, so that's a kind of typical sample type question. Well done, you passed. Let's talk about some other things that you might want to configure as part of installing Windows. Configuring a virtual smart card. This is quite new. Some of you might have experience of smart cards for logon, for user authentication. There's been a shift now from having the physical smart card to a virtual smart card where we use a TPM chip on our computer to store that information. So my user identity is stored in certificate form on my local TPM. So it's saved in that safe place on the computer. So I can use that as a means of identifying myself on my network. Why this is being called out is it's new. You may not have had experience of it, but it's a new thing that Microsoft is kind of pushing people into to say, well, these smart cards, they get lost. Basically, your device is your smart card, right? So you're going to always, it's harder to lose a computer than a smart card in effect. But you're going to have the computer anyway, so let's just get rid of the physical smart card and just store it as a piece of software. Things you need to know for the test, how to manage this, know how to use the tools to actually add smart cards to computers. We've called out here the TPM Service Management Program. Fire it up if you've never seen that before. I've included it on the slide for you. And again, it's a command line tool as well. So start learning some of those switches too. All right, sorry about that, but that's the way it is. Some of these are command line programs. You've got to know how to automate that, because if you're rolling out Windows 10 to 10,000 PCs, you're not going to go around and use a GUI tool 10,000 times. You're going to do a script that automates that process. Again, another table here just for reference. I'm not going to read them all out. There's way too many. But I mentioned at the start, you've got to kind of know the difference between the two main SKUs here, Windows 10 Pro and Windows 10 Enterprise. That's really what your exam is going to focus on. Know what's available in both. Some questions are relatively gift questions if you just simply know what's included and what's not. You know, if you've got a company that says, we need to deploy direct access, we want to have Windows 10 devices connect from home back to the corporate office so users can work from application servers from home, and they want to use direct access for that, immediately I know, Pro, that's not going to work. It's going to have to be Enterprise for that. Okay? Some organizations deploy a mixture of these, and that's fine as well. But know the differences, specifically the bottom half of that table. What can Enterprise do that Pro cannot? Okay, and let's talk about installing Windows. We've done some of this already, but let's go through some more sections to do with installing it, particularly around things like updates and VHD usage as well. So again, I'm going to call out some command line for you, running switches for updating Windows. We can update Windows as part of the setup process itself. So we're downloading the fresh install of an operating system with updates, or we can put updates on afterwards. So know the different ways of doing that. Here we're talking about being able to install extra things alongside setup, such as language packs, such as different components when you're doing the setup. So when you've deployed it, it's ready to go for the user. That minimizes the post-install time. But you can also do these things afterwards, so research both ways of doing so. Something that's probably a little bit new for some of you here is knowing the difference between current branch and current branch for business. Who's familiar with that? Hands up. Oh, good. Most people, but about 25% in the room not so familiar with that. Yeah, Windows 10, it's all new. It's Windows as a service these days. So Windows 10 is not just a product you're going to install once and then walk away and it's good for 4 years. No, it's going to need to be refreshed from time to time. We've got this new update coming out very soon, in fact, haven't we? The Fall Creators Update. Well, what if I don't want the latest and greatest on my computers? What if I prefer to hold back a little so I have some time for testing? I want to make sure my applications are going to work with those new builds. We can defer, not indefinitely, but we can defer updates. So one thing I want you to kind of go and research is how long can we defer those updates? How long can we defer the new builds for? I'm not going to give you that answer today. I want you to find out. You can defer. There's 2 ways. You can do it in the interface, in the Settings app, which is on the left-hand side, but also you can group policy control that as well, which is on the right-hand side, and I've got the path to where those can be found in group policy as well. Please find out when, how do I do that? There's other associated settings as well in group policy. Make a point of finding those. If I was a test taker, I'd want to make sure I'd found those because it's new stuff. Microsoft always likes to test you, not just on the old stuff, but on the new things. That's what discriminates a qualified candidate from an unqualified candidate. In other words, we don't want to just expect that, hey, you did the Windows 7 exam and you maybe did the Windows 8.1 exam, great. You should not be able to just go ahead and sit at Windows 10 with no preparation. There's things here that are brand new. I would expect questions on that personally because it's new tech and it's new, interesting questions. So do look into Windows as a service, but particularly here we're calling out the configuration of that on the machine. OK, something that's not used a huge amount, but still could make for an interesting exam question is native boot. How do we boot our machine up? Now, typically, this is kind of a non-issue, because when you've deployed Windows, it just gets on and boots up. The minute you press your power button, you expect it to work. But you folks are supporting Windows. What if it doesn't work? What if you need to modify that? What if you want to add another boot option and have a dual boot system? You do need to know a little bit about how to control that, specifically with disk tools. Might be disk management, might be PowerShell commands, but also the use of BCD edits. Hands up who's run BCD edit before. Ooh, OK, good. About 60%. Good. All right. So know what that's about. When do I use BCD edit? What's the circumstances for me using it? And again, command line switches, I'm afraid. Get learning those. When would I run it? What am I running it for? And that also comes into play if you're adding multiple boot choices. I've, for many years, had more than one operating system running on my computer before Hyper-V came around. So I could check out different operating systems and run previous ones side by side. Nowadays, with Hyper-V, I don't really do that, because I just use virtual machines. But it's still a perfectly valid way of doing things. What you could do is you could create a virtual hard drive, install an operating system into that, and then associate it as a boot option, so that when you start your computer, you can boot from the C drive as normal, or you can boot from your pre-canned virtual hard drive image as well. Because of Hyper-V, most people don't actually get to see this for real, but please try it out, or at least research the steps involved in doing so. It's reasonably straightforward, but if you're like me and you run Hyper-V a lot, you may not have actually done this. So try it, or at least read up on that. Also, a few things during the upgrade process that you need to know about that are kind of important, particularly for enterprises. Installing language add-ons. That's something you can definitely do during setup. You could do it post-setup as well. We talked about that before. But you can actually modify languages in the image. So I'm calling out for the first time here, DISM, D-I-S-M, is a tool that can be used to modify images, to add languages, let's say, for example, to an offline image, so one that's actually not yet deployed. So you can download language packs and put them into your image. And you might be doing that because you've got a multinational audience of computers on your network. It may be the right thing to do rather than expect the user to do that afterwards, especially if their UI language is unknown to them from your core image. Disk encryption is worth a mention too. Obviously, Windows has BitLocker. That's great. But also, some companies use third-party disk encryption. How is that going to interfere with the setup process? Generally, with BitLocker, life is good. It's really a non-issue. But If you've got third-party disk encryption tools, you sometimes have to turn them off or disable disk encryption. Then you're going to run setup and install Windows, and then you'll re-encrypt afterwards. That differs depending on your third party, but look at the differences between native BitLocker encryption and third party. Again, it's well documented online. The next section here is talking about devices and device drivers. So the kinds of tasks you'll need to be aware of are how to install and update. And these days, we do get a little bit lazy on this as IT professionals because Windows does a pretty good job about downloading them for us. But that's not always appropriate. Do I expect 1,000 PCs to be deployed on my network where they require a download from the internet, or do I put the driver on for them and include it in an image? I also have to be aware of the issue around unsigned drivers and how Windows is basically going to reject that by default. If you're trying to use an old driver or something that's not signed digitally, Windows' normal behavior is to say, no, that's not going to be allowed. You can modify that behavior. Did you know? How do you do it? Find out. You also need to know about importing packages, and that's particularly true when you want to download a whole bunch of, say, OEM drivers for your build. How do you inject those in? So again, DISM is being called out here as a way to do that. It's not the only way, but it's a pretty good way of installing into an image a bunch of drivers in an automated way. So you're not expecting the user or yourself to have to do that manually. I won't spend a great deal of time on here, but this is on the objective domain area. Tasks that you might need to do post-install. These are relatively easier compared to some of the stuff we've just been talking about, command line tools and switches, but nevertheless, don't lose out on easy marks. Things like configuring Internet Explorer. There are settings in there. Know how to configure internet zones, cookie settings, things like that. You don't probably do that every day, but it's reasonably straightforward. Hyper-V, how do you get that set up? I've got a screen, I think, coming up for that in a second. Also, Cortana, the digital assistant in Windows. Hands up who uses Cortana on their PC. About 10%, okay? It's a love-hate feature, right? Irrespective of that, I personally love it, but irrespective of that, figure out how to do that. It's not difficult. And some of you might say, well, in our enterprise environment, it's not something we use. We've got other tools or whatever, or we've just decided it's not for us. Fine. But please figure out how to do it. You can do it in several ways. You can do it during setup of Windows as part of the finishing off process before Windows is ready for the first time. You can do it when you first click on it. You can actually go back in and make changes to that configuration as well. So not difficult, but if you're like the majority of people in this room who never actually use it at work, I wouldn't want you to miss out on a couple of simple percentage marks for that. It's not just that. I've just used that one as an example, but Edge browser, Internet Explorer settings, etc. Another one I'm going to call out here, though, is Hyper-V. That's a pretty good feature. This ability to run virtual machines from your Windows 10 computer instead of having to do it from a server. This is actually baked into Pro and Enterprise nowadays, but it does need to be installed. Although the feature is there, it's not present by default. You have to go and do something to make it work. Okay? Anyone know what that thing is? What do you have to do to make that work? It's an optional feature, right? So go into the settings, go and add a Windows optional component to get that on, and then reboot the computer. Reasonably straightforward. But again, I'm going to call back to what we said at the beginning, work out what are the hardware requirements for that too. Not all Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise PCs will have that capability, especially if you're running 32-bit Windows, for example. Well, once you've got it there, know how to configure it. If you have a look on the top right-hand side of this picture, there's Hyper-V settings on the right-hand bar. There's virtual machine settings. Make sure you're familiar with those for the Hyper-V computer as a whole, but also for a virtual machine individually. Walk through the settings. Okay? There's not a huge amount of property sheets to examine here, but make sure you've been thorough and you've checked out all the defaults. For example, where am I saving my VHDs by default? Where am I saving my virtual machine configuration files by default? That's all up here in the Hyper-V settings on the right-hand side. Also know about some of the new features. We've got Generation 1 machines and Generation 2 machines. Figure out the differences on those. Also, there's a whole bunch of new stuff around checkpoints. We've now got the ability to take production checkpoints. That does not preserve the memory of a machine. It's only going to preserve the hard drive saved information. Again, check it out, see how to configure it, know the differences between a production checkpoint and a non-production checkpoint. I've also put on here PowerShell. You'll need to know some PowerShell. Some tools are only PowerShell. Some tools you can do in a GUI or a command line or a PowerShell. You've got to kind of have a bit of an awareness of these things. You know, do not be surprised to have questions on your exam where they're looking for you to configure something in PowerShell. So if possible, whenever you're doing your research on how do I configure XYZ, see if there's a PowerShell method for that. It could just be that your question on the exam is going to ask you it that way. And so let's take a look at the enterprise stuff. And I mentioned this at the beginning. If you're not familiar with working in an enterprise, if you're working for a very small company, you've got 5 PCs, it's not quite an enterprise. So some of these things here might catch you out. So tools, I mean, anybody can use the WCD tool. You're more likely to use it in a bigger network. Same goes for MDT and such like. But there are particular issues that come up, such as activating Windows, KMS activation, Active Directory activation, that frankly, if you're in a small network, you're probably not going to have come across that. So let's go and take a look at some of those things. Windows does need to be activated. There are numerous ways to do that. The classical way, I guess, is to use KMS activation on the network. Anybody here have a KMS server on their network? Wow, loads of people. All right, so it's a single point on your network to which the computer's going to activate to, instead of having to go across the internet to Microsoft. But that's valid as well. You can do that. But most enterprise networks probably don't want all of their PCs going back to Microsoft individually. They want to go to a single point that the administrator can manage and track. And that's really KMS traditionally. But nowadays, we can also do Active Directory-based activation. Similar idea to KMS, but instead of having a single point on the network, we can use any domain controller to get that done. But there are a few nuances. Is it any domain controller? Is it a Windows 2008 domain controller, or is there some other thing? Find out. Find out what's necessary. You're doing a Windows 10 exam, so you're not being asked to build out that infrastructure here necessarily, but you need to be aware of what things have to be in place for me to successfully deploy Windows 10. What are the infrastructure requirements for me? It could be a KMS server. It could be Active Directory activation. If you're the Windows deployment person, you need to ask that of your network. Do we have this? Do we have the necessary components to perform AD-based activation? Okay, I'm not feeding you all the answers here. I want you to research this. All right, find out what's required for AD activation. It's relatively new. There's a shopping list of things you need. Okay, and I'm going to call out again some command line. slmgr.vbs. If you are not familiar with that, you're not ready for your test. All right, there's some command line switches with that will help you to identify, is your machine activated? How is it activated? You can install product keys with that. So I've put on here a few, but there are way loads, a few of the main command line switches. But please do check it out. If you type on a machine, slmgr.vbs/?, you'll get the whole list. It's also documented on a TechNet webpage if that's easier as well. I've only put just literally a few on there that are pretty useful. So /IPK/ATO are some of the most popular ones. Again, an area that's reasonably straightforward but will catch folks out, user account control settings. We have that in Control Panel, but most people in an enterprise environment will probably have this configured in Group Policy. Please look at both. Look at the UI and look at the GPO ways of configuring this. And this is all about, what some tasks I do, for example, in Control Panel, require admin access to be able to do that, so a standard user is not going to be able to unless they can provide alternate credentials to get that done that have admin privilege. But how that works, which processes, figure it out. And in fact, we've got a question coming up on that in a second I'm going to leave for now. Also have some general awareness of Active Directory. We're starting to touch on these enterprise concepts. You should be familiar with the terms like forest, domain, Active Directory site. You don't need to be a guru in all of that. This is not the Active Directory exam you're taking, but This device is highly likely to sit on an Active Directory network, so those concepts you need to be familiar with. All right, so just have a slightly more than passing knowledge of those things to help you. But know things like group policy. We use that extensively to configure Windows in the enterprise. There are thousands, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 settings nowadays with group policy that you can use to control Windows and how it works. Good news is you don't need to memorize 4,000 or 5,000 settings, but you do need to know, how does this work? How do I configure it? Where? Which tools? And on the client side, how do I troubleshoot that? You've got to know a little bit about GP update to force updates down to your machine instead of waiting for the cycle to come around. You also need to know how to report on that on the local machine to see, is it updating? When was it last updated? So again, some command line programs, GP result will help you. If you can try out Group Policy Management Console to get familiar with the UI, better still. You'll need to know a little bit about how policies are created and how they inherit, because you can stack them up. You can have policies inherit downwards in a complementary way. You can have a domain-based policy that downloads a whole bunch of generic settings, and then an OU-based policy that adds to that and complements it. So you know about that inheritance structure. So here's a quick practice question here, and this is a UAC question. Let's take a look. You're planning your company's user account control policies and need to provide the security team with a list of actions which do not require UAC. We have to select 3 which do not require UAC. Okay? Is it installing Windows updates, configuring Windows Update settings, installing a device driver from a USB drive, pairing a Bluetooth microphone and headset, configuring firewall settings, or configuring accessibility settings? So we're looking for 3 of those, please. ADF, someone said a couple of times. Let's have a look. ADF is correct. Installing updates, pairing a Bluetooth microphone, and accessibility settings, anybody can do that. You don't need to be an admin. You don't need UAC elevation for those tasks. Everything else is something that might affect the system. So for example, update settings. You could be trying to turn off Windows Update settings. That's not something an end user would be allowed to go anywhere near. Yeah, good job. A couple of tips from this section I want to just quickly go over before we go to the next section. Understand USMT, command line switches. Get used to that stuff. We've talked about a few command line tools through this section. Try them out. Memorize command line switches as much as possible. I know that's a difficult one, but that will help. Know the difference between the different install scenarios, upgrade versus in place, when would I use each kind. Know about the activation methods and what's appropriate given a circumstance. Know about things like the 32 and 64-bit differences and things like group policy application. And if you're good for those, then you're ready for section 2. Here we are. So this section here is configure and support core services. We're looking at things like networking, storage, data access, applications, and remote management in this section. So again, I'm not going to touch every single bullet point, but we'll go through and have a look at a few of these. Networking is probably the toughest because it's got the longest list of things that you need to know. And I could spend easily an hour on every single one of those. And by the way, that's only page 1 of 2 when it comes to networking. So you need to know things like IP addressing, subnets, the IP logic stuff. Some of you might have been doing that for years if you're gray-haired like me. But if you're new to that, do you need to dust off how to subnet, how to configure a computer appropriate to the network it's on, identifying what the default gateway should be, for example. And that's going to be both in the user interface and from command line too. And these days, that can include PowerShell. Other things you need to look at are things like direct access and VPN settings. And those tend to be a little tougher. So figure out how those get done and different VPN settings that you can configure for a connection as well. And we'll pick up on a few of those here. I'm just going to whiz through real quick. But IP4, like I say, know about how to configure it, where it gets configured, how to troubleshoot, and also how to display IP settings to see what's wrong. We'll have a practice question coming up on that very soon. Okay, know about network locations. Windows is going to be placed on a network. Of course it is. What kind of network? What's the difference between a public network and a private network? What changes when we place it on different networks? The firewall rules change, for example. Know about that. Also know about switching locations. What if you said, hey, my computer's on a public network, and then you went, actually, no, it's not. This is the corporate network, or this is my home network. You can switch those around. I would use PowerShell for that myself, to change the network profile for that given network. We no longer have a place in the user interface to get that done. We used to in Windows 7. Know about the firewall? The firewall relates back to those profiles. Which ports are going to be open, which traffic is allowed in and out of my machine in any given type of network. They're aggregated, so all domain networks would have the same set of rules. All public networks that you touch would have the same set of rules. So you're defining a set of in and out rules in each case. Now, there's several UI interfaces for this. This one is straight out of Control Panel, but there's also the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security version of that, which goes deeper, where you can establish more specific rules and review the existing ones that are there too. And you can see which rules are deactivated and activated. There's a whole lot you'll find if you click on inbound or outbound rules. You'll find there's a whole lot of established ones which are there present but are grayed out because they're not currently active. Sometimes turning things on in Control Panel gets those activated. Sometimes you need to activate them. That's why that tool exists. And back to our friend PowerShell. PowerShell is another valid way to configure that. If I want to establish a new rule or see which rule is active, we can use tools like get net firewall rule or enable disable net firewall rule to play with those. So the user interface isn't technically required. It makes sense on a day-to-day basis, but if you're configuring 1,000 PCs, you're more likely to want to do that from PowerShell. Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi Direct, yeah. I've got a computer. In fact, all my computers I have now don't use Ethernet. They all use Wi-Fi. This is predominant. You've probably got good experience from a user perspective on this, but know how to troubleshoot that. Why is my machine not seeing certain networks? What do I need to change? What could have been modified on my system? Why can't I connect? What are the issues likely to be? Some Wi-Fi networks require certificates, especially corporate networks. Some use different SSIDs. What if you've got overlapping signals? How does my Windows machine cope with that? Also, use PowerShell. Use NetSH to discover networks and to see their strengths and see what's in range. So if you haven't, who's never come across NetSH before? Ooh, everybody has, fantastic. Okay, well, NetSH has a subcontext you can go into there to review Wi-Fi settings and to see networks that are in range for you. So that's a great tool. There'll be an emphasis on troubleshooting. What's wrong with this picture? This computer can't connect. What's wrong? Maybe there's a screenshot. Maybe there's a text explanation of what's wrong. But you might get something like this picture here and say, this is what you can see. What's wrong with this picture? Why is it not able to connect? Oh, it's got the wrong DNS settings. It's got the wrong subnet mask. There's no default gateway. Often you're looking for things like that. But also have a troubleshooting methodology. This is kind of a really good one here to identify what is the problem with the network, because it can be 1,000,001 things, right? If a computer can't connect to a network, why can't it connect? Has it got the right IP configuration? Is there a hardware issue? Has the network adapter failed? Does it need resetting or computer rebooting? Is the software side of it correct? Are we configured on the right subnet mask? Are we pointing to the right DNS servers? Can we resolve names? If we can connect to things on IP addresses, but we can't resolve names, then it's a name resolution thing that's likely to be DNS. So in that spirit, let's take a look at this practice question. I want to know basically what's wrong with this picture. Let's read it out. You're the help desk technician at contoso.com. A user calls you because they are unable to access a resource on server 1. You ask the user for the IP address of the computer and walk the user through getting you that information. The IP address is as displayed on the right. And the question here is, what should you do? Should you add a default gateway to the network card, enable IP routing, check the DHCP server to see if it's online and has IP addresses available, or check the DNS server to see if it's online and able to resolve server 1? Yeah, C. Because? Well identified. Good job. 169.254 is the prefix here on that IP address. And yep, we've got some qualified candidates in the room by the looks of things. That's good. This is an IP address we're going to have if our computer is configured to use DHCP but has been unable to connect and get an address from the DHCP server. Windows 10 will automatically configure an APIPA address. Always going to be 169.254. Memorize that number. 169.254 something something means we've been unable to get the correct address from our expected DHCP server. So the likelihood is it's probably the DHCP server. If I was troubleshooting this on a network, I'd want to see probably if other computers were in the same situation. That's usually going to point to it being a server-based problem. Good job, you're doing well on these. You might even pass. All right, next section, storage. There's a ton in here. We don't have time to deep dive on all of this, but the kinds of tasks for storage are configuring disks, configuring with command line, disk part, disk management, snap-in, PowerShell. Also storage spaces, learn storage spaces. Okay, you're not using it every day, I appreciate. It's something we typically think of in conjunction with servers, but you can build out all kinds of different disk layouts using storage pools, storage spaces. Please play with that. It's really easy to set that up in a virtual machine and test it. You don't need to have a variety of different physical hard drives to actually do this. In a lab environment, in your training lab, build it out. Add some virtual hard disks to a VM and see how you can add those into a pool and build out different scenarios with that. And also kind of know the difference between the different sorts of storage space virtual disks that you can make. There's parity disks and there's RAID 1 disks and that sort of thing. You'll certainly want to also look at things like data access. One thing that always perennially catches people out is permissions. Share permissions, NTFS permissions. It's almost like a trap, and you can see it coming for candidates because it's something that folks don't always do regularly, and it is always confusing. You've got two access control lists. If I'm presenting a shared folder to the network from my machine or on a server, why can I not connect to that? Is it the share permissions, or is it the NTFS permissions on the right that's blocking me? And the fact is, both of those have to be compatible. For you to be able to access this shared folder over the network, both of these access control lists have to permit you. Which is going to be, how do we work out really, like what's the way to figure out somebody's access? Is it that share permissions are always the most powerful? Is it that NTFS are the most powerful? What's the logic here? The most restrictive, thank you, the most restrictive, whichever that is. There is a myth out there that NTFS is always the most powerful and that always wins. Not quite that straightforward. For example, if my share permission says read on the left, but my NTFS permission on the right says full control, the most restrictive of those, of course, is read. So my net result is that I only have read access to that. All right, so play around with that. Also, there's a couple of different ways in Windows 10 to configure this stuff in the user interface as well. For applications, yeah, something that's not in everybody's wheelhouse is apps, especially store-based apps. We're in the cloud era nowadays. Applications may not be MSI deployed from your network. Some applications might be onboarded in different ways now. So yeah, you still got to know about MSIs and MSI exec, but you do need to know about some of the new type of apps that you could get from either the Windows Store or from the Store for Business. So know a little about this because Microsoft is pushing us down this route now. I've heard that a few times this week already, where we want to get everybody to get their applications from the cloud in some shape or form. Now, that could be the generic store that anybody can access, right? And if you're going to access that, you need what? What do I need to access the Windows Store? A Microsoft account, right? It's a personal individual account, a Microsoft account like you would have for your Xbox. But also, in a corporate environment, you're less likely to want to have users do that. You might have them connect up to a Windows Store for Business where you've curated the list of applications for them and bought the licenses on their behalf. To do that, we're either going to use a federated Active Directory account or an Azure Active Directory username to connect up. So it looks a little like this. The tabs you see at the top of the screenshot here, like Home, Apps, Games, and Music, anybody would be able to see those if they had just a regular Microsoft account. The tab at the top, I've created a store for business called Windows Store for Business, WSFB. I've created that for my organization, and I've curated a list of applications in there I want my users to be able to download. So they may be free, they may be paid for, but I'm going to configure that as the administrator. They just see a list here of 4 apps in this case, that I would like them to have and see and download. They may not need to have a Microsoft account at all. They're going to use an organizational logon, in other words, an AAD credential to get there. Okay, has anybody built or used Store for Business, Windows Store for Business? One person, okay, good for you. You're going to pass, I know it. Okay, so I'm trying to open up the gaps here for you. Don't feel bad about that. This is what you need to plug the gap with today. Also, when it comes to Store apps, they surface themselves in a few different ways. In the Settings app nowadays, you can see what's installed. You can also see how much space and bandwidth they're consuming as well. You can easily remove them from a single point as well. You should also have some experience about side-loading apps. Maybe people don't actually go to the internet to get those Store apps. Maybe you put them on the machines on their behalf. In which case, our friend PowerShell is going to come and help us out with that one. We're going to use tools like add Apex provisioned package or get Apex package. Apex is really the name for a Store app, like an MSI would be for a 32-bit app to help us install. Apex package is the equivalent for Store applications. So the simple fact is you might have created your own in-house, or you might have bought some, and you're going to add them to a machine without needing to go to the internet. Now, this is called side loading. Worth reading up on that. All right, it's PowerShell basically. Okay, next up, remote management. I'm going to whiz through this one pretty quick, but know things like setting up remote desktop, setting up remote assistance, being able to use PowerShell remotely to connect to other systems. Maybe I'm troubleshooting a user's PC and connecting from my desktop to theirs using PowerShell sessions to connect and fix their problem. Okay, let's see if you're paying attention. Another practice question. You're the administrator for Contoso.com. A user named Jane attempts to access a resource on server 1 named LegalDocs, and that's on //server1/LegalDocs, but they are denied access. She then uses remote desktop to connect to server 1, opens File Explorer, and is able to access LegalDocs. You need to make sure that when Jane attempts to access LegalDocs, she's always denied access. All other users should not be affected by any change you make. So you're going to connect to server 1 through computer management, expand shared folders, you click LegalDocs, you then click Properties. What should you be doing next? Should you, on the Share Permissions, add Jane's account and select Deny Read? Should you be on the Security tab, adding Jane's account and specifying Deny Read? Should you be on the General tab, changing the user limit to 0, or changing the share name to LegalDocs $? What do you think? Ooh, bit of a mixture there, bit of a mixture. Well, the answer is B. We're connecting, we're told, through remote desktop directly onto server 1. We're then looking through Explorer directly on that server. Technically, we're not going through the share. The share permissions are not in scope. All right? We're actually going to be going and configuring the NTFS permissions here because that's going to fire whatever happens, whether she's accessing it from her PC over the network, or in this case, she's actually remote desktoped onto the server and is looking at those files locally. Maybe she's in a RDS session. Yeah, so the NTFS permissions are the only ones being used in this scenario. Changing the user limit to 0 means that no one can connect to the share. Again, she's not coming in through the share. Changing the share name, also not going to have any impact. All right, let's have a quick sum up then from this section. A few tips. Refresh yourself on subnetting. If you don't know that stuff too well, go over the basics. That can earn you lots of points, hopefully. Know your subnetting. Know also, even though we've got things like PowerShell commandlets to do networking, troubleshooting, and config, don't forget good old-fashioned NetSH. There's lots you can do with that. And as we've just seen, learn the difference between shared and NTFS permissions and their relationships. In the previous question there, we were not actually using the share. We were kind of mysteriously guiding you down that path initially, but the meat of the question said, no, we're not going through the share. We're going locally through that folder, not coming in over the network. OK, last section, guys, hang in there. Managing and maintaining Windows. So again, third of the marks on this section here. We're looking at things like configuring updates, monitoring Windows, data recovery, authorization and authentication, and some management tools. So configuring updates. We could be here all day. In fact, I wrote a book on this, in fact, so I'll keep this brief. But configuring updates, the different ways to get this done. Know about WSUS, know about Windows Update on the internet. We also talked about deferring updates previously, so that comes back into play here as well. And also in an enterprise network, it's quite common that administrators will use System Center Configuration Manager to distribute updates as well. So there's different ways of achieving the same goal. Do I get it to go to the internet or a server on premises for updates? How do we configure the machine for that? Okay. Again, go back to group policy, go back to the UI, familiarize yourselves with what's in there. Again, we've got the settings app and the group policies being called out. Different things to before, but just to re-emphasize the fact that you do need to be familiar with both sets. Yeah, quick question.
Do they call it Intune on this at all using MDM?
Do they call out Intune on this? Not so much on this exam. On other tests? Sure. Know about update history. We can roll back updates. We can uninstall them. We can see what's already installed. That's a nice simple one. I like to use get hotfix in PowerShell to determine what's installed because I can provide a list and pipe that out. Store apps need to be updated. They don't quite get updated in exactly the same way. There's configuration in the settings app for that and in group policy to determine how you're going to get updates for your store apps. And also something that's quite new that came in, I don't know, about a year ago actually, is the ability now to fetch updates from other computers on the same network as you. So that if a room full of computers that you all had, if you all broke out your laptops right now and all needed to go to the internet for the same update, it would be able to work out, there's other computers on your subnet coming from the same place that actually have those updates available, so you can peer-to-peer that rather than fetching in duplicate. That's what the bottom selection here, PCs on my local network and PCs on the internet, that's what that setting relates to. Very simple, but can save a lot of bandwidth. Okay, next section here is all about monitoring windows. We have a ton of different tools in here. Again, I'm going to skirt through pretty quickly, but my main tip here is learn which tool does which job. You know, think of these tools we're going to discuss here as like a toolbox, right? So if you're a handyman and you've got a toolbox and you open that toolbox, do I take out the screwdriver or the hammer? What am I trying to do right now? Am I trying to bash a nail or am I trying to undo a screw? So you've got to know which tool is best suited, and people do get a bit mixed up on some of these, I'll be honest, because there's a whole variety. So let's try and think of this. One tip I would pass on is some tools are better suited for real-time monitoring, real-time fixing. Some are better for looking at information that's already happened in a historical sense. So for example, Event Viewer. You're looking at things that happened today, yesterday, last month. Whereas tools like Task Manager are very much in the here and now, real-time information only. Okay, so get used to Event Viewer. Event Viewer's probably been something you've used before, I imagine, but something that does catch folk out is subscriptions, being able to pipe certain messages to a central place. If I have 100 PCs, I need to check for a certain event happening across 100 PCs. I don't want to open Event Viewer 100 times. I want to have those 100 PCs feeding that information to a central collector computer and then look in one place on one PC to review those logged events. That's called an event subscription if you've never come across it before. You can configure it in the interface or with wecutil.exe. Again, some simple ones here, Task Manager, Resource Monitor. These tools have come on leaps and bounds. If you haven't really used Task Manager, it's well worth drilling down through the tabs. But again, real-time information. It's good to see what apps are running. And a cool thing that I really like now is the Startup tab that they added. You can see which applications are harming your boot process. And over time, you always add more and more apps to your system. What's slowing that down? What's giving you boot time performance issues? Have a look on the Startup tab. That may help you. Resource Monitor is not so much about that, but the actual resource utilization. How's my CPU doing? How's my memory doing? Or what's draining those things? You can absolutely drill down and see the processes consuming that performance. There is an overlap to Task Manager, but neither have historical information other than the graph for about 10 or 15 seconds. Performance Monitor also can give you real-time data, but has also got the ability to create data collector sets, so you can record and review later. You decide on which counters you want to look at, might be CPU, might be hard drive performance. You put that into a file, you can watch that graph back later on. You don't have to look at it in real time, but it will do real time as well. Defender's built in. This is great. Saves me a lot of money buying a third-party antivirus, anti-malware solution. It's baked in. You may not be using it in your enterprise because you may have a third-party one, but the exam is assuming you are going to use the built-in services. Know how to configure it. It's not that difficult to do it in the Settings app, to look at the real-time protection settings. And again, you've got PowerShell to go with that. Okay? System and data recovery. This is going to confuse some people too. There are tons of tools that will help you. Again, I've got a whole list. How do I recover? Know what to use and when. It's like that toolbox. I've got a file I deleted. How should I restore that? Should I get it back from my recycle bin? Should I get it back from my OneDrive recycle bin? You know, there's different ways. Should I do a restore from a backup? Sometimes there's multiple answers to that. We've got to look for any given exam question. What are the circumstances surrounding that? Is it a system thing or is it a data thing? That's the first thing you've got to differentiate. Is it something to do with the computer? You've installed an update, your system's not so good, you want to roll back the system. Right, well, it's not a data question, so I'm halving my options now for my answers. I've got to look at a solution that's going to give me the ability to restore my system back to a healthy state. But you can also have questions that are more data-orientated that would have nothing to do with a system rollback or a driver rollback. So try and distinguish that way first. Things like recovery drives are great. When would you use a recovery drive? Anyone got an answer for that? At what point do you use a recovery drive? Well, troubleshoot a system that won't start. You can all read. But don't confuse that with recovery partitions. OEMs quite often put a recovery partition on a user hard drive so they can get back to a core build. This is slightly different. This is making sure that you can boot a machine if it won't start. Maybe your BCD has got corrupted. All right, you've got system restore tools. Check out the settings for that in the control panel system area. Are we protecting your system? On the screenshot on the right, the C drive is not being monitored for this. It's not being protected. We can turn that on. So that the whole point to that is we can go back to a previous point in time. For example, maybe I install an application yesterday and it seems good to begin with, but then today my system really is running like a dog and I want to go back to that good working state that I had yesterday. A restore point is good for that. All right? But also we have a slightly bigger setting like reset the PC to put it back to factory defaults, for example, or to refresh Windows back on if it doesn't seem to be behaving very well. There's two ways of playing that. You can reset the whole computer if you're donating to somebody else, giving it to a family member, get rid of your data, or you can refresh Windows and put a fresh copy of Windows back on, keeping the data. Okay? Have a look at file history. In scope for the exam also is cloud services, so OneDrive for Business. You can do file restore. In fact, I had to use that myself the other day. I'd accidentally overwritten a file. Being a good person, I have backups, right? I save my files in OneDrive. They're uploaded to the cloud, so if my computer crashes out, not the end of the world. But then, stupidly, I overwrote a ton of work that I'd been doing all morning with an old version, and it was user error, put my hand up to that. But I didn't panic because I knew that I could go into OneDrive and go through the version history and go back through all the different saves that I had over the last few days and pull those back. Right? Very useful feature in OneDrive. If I didn't have that, I'd be looking at file history on my local machine to configure that instead. When it comes to authentication, again, too many to call out, but I'm just going to mention a few things. Know the differences between the different authentication providers like Azure AD and Active Directory, but also there's a whole ton of new stuff, isn't there, nowadays? Windows Hello. Some of you are lucky enough to have surfaces and things like that where you can do facial recognition or fingerprint recognition. That's fantastic. Know a little bit about how that works. We rely on the computer's hardware for that. Okay. Know about what's required on a hardware level to support some of these features. Also, we're in this cloud world where we're not always traditionally connecting to an Active Directory domain. That might be the mainstay for most of you, but quite a lot of you will be transitioning, if you haven't already, to joining an Azure Active Directory rather than an Active Directory. So there's a different couple of ways to do that in each case. And don't forget, you can use provisioning packages or setup to help you automate that, but also know how you do it afterwards. We've got programs like djoin.exe, if you haven't come across that. That's an offline domain join. djoin.exe if you haven't come across it before. Home groups can catch folks out. You might work in an enterprise environment. Well, that's great. You're a 99% fit for this exam. But you could fall down if you've never configured Windows in a home group. That's also in scope for the exam. Sharing between PCs, peer-to-peer, in a very small home environment, home groups could be configured in the test questions too. I would also look at device registration. Come and see my session later on this afternoon if you want to know more about that. But connecting to Azure AD and getting your Windows 10 device registered so we know about it to help with single sign-on, to make it easier for the user to connect to Office 365 and other cloud apps. A lot of people are doing that nowadays. What do you need to do to set that up or to connect up to your network from the internet as well? If you're connecting to your network in that way and doing device registration to your network for BYOD devices, you'll need to set up a few things like ADFS proxies and some DNS records. A few people do that these days. OK, advanced tools. Just spend a moment on these. There's a whole raft of other tools, such as Task Scheduler and services. Have a little play with those. Configuring services is not that difficult, but it could be if it was PowerShell. So maybe I'm getting a service to change its startup behavior from manual to automatic or to disabled if I don't want it to run, and who it runs as. Could get questions around that. And it's also worth reviewing Task Scheduler because there's a bunch of built-in tasks that run as part of your Windows installation, and you can add other processes to that as well. If you want to run a particular program every Friday at 12 o'clock, that's the tool for getting that done. PowerShell I could spend all day on, but yeah, we've seen some question examples of that come through the slide deck. But you've got to know this because it's very much part and parcel of modern day administration on these modern operating systems. It's most definitely in scope for any potential exam question because like everything can be done with PowerShell, really. So don't be surprised about that. You could get questions that are asking you a GUI way of doing it or a PowerShell. Be prepared for that. Okay, don't be surprised. We do get people complaining, oh, I didn't know it was going to be so much PowerShell. It is to be expected across not just this, but basically all exams these days. So do, if you can, understand how to create scripts, batch jobs, how to schedule jobs as well. That would help. All right, one last question for you folks. Let's see if you're going to pass this thing. You're the help desk technician for Contoso.com. A user connects to her desktop each evening from home to run some reports. The user calls you to tell you that recently the reports seem to be taking a long time to run. You decide to schedule the collection of the relevant performance data. Which tool below allows you to schedule the capturing of performance data? Is it Resource Monitor, Task Manager, Performance Monitor, Data Collector Sets, or Event Viewer? Yeah, OK. So C and D would actually be technically correct because the data collector set is actually in Performance Monitor, so I'll let you have that as well. Bad question, Chris. But data collector sets is kind of the tool for the job there. That's for the record it now or record it in the future and watch that information back later. OK, so you can set it up to say, I want that to record at 3 p.m. and I'll come back tomorrow and look at that information. Technically, it is part of Performance Monitor, though, so I'd let you off on that one. All right, top tips on that section, guys. Understand all the recovery options, files and data, distinguish those. Know how to do things like rolling back an operating system, roll back an update. Know about the tools. There's a bewildering quantity of tools, which is hard to get your head around, but it's sort of encouraging from a perspective of, I've got lots of choices, and that's nice to have. For you folks, that makes it a little bit hard to distinguish when would I use each one. So get the difference between file history, OneDrive recovery, backup restore. There is some overlap between some of those. If you can try and identify the niches, great. And I'll just finish up by saying, if you need some extra help, we've got the study hall here this week. We've got MCTs outside that can help you, MCT ambassadors. If you want to get a book, this would be the one I would buy. Quite often get asked for book recommendations. That's the official exam reference guide for this exam. So that's been written to the exact same points that we've been talking to today. All right? But that gives you a much greater opportunity to dive into depth than the hour or so we've had together today. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for sticking with us. Please evaluate the sessions. As always, your feedback is definitely recommended. We'd like to hear that. Thank you for your time.